Here we are, Chapter 17, Connecting a Nation. We want to talk about the role that infrastructure had in developing our nation and really causing a lot of economic growth. So in the book, we talk a lot about rivers, canals, railroads, and roads. And so I'll leave that to the book. I want to extend a little bit more about why these are so important that may not be necessarily covered in the book. So we talk about water transportation. So here's just a few pictures to show how much water transportation grew. So in 1815, this is where they had the navigable rivers. They had machinery to be able to go up and down the river. By 1840, it expands greatly. By 1865 and 1890, just very large increases. The steamboat being one of the biggest drivers of innovation that allowed this to happen. But one thing you see even in 1890 is there's just large spots of land, particularly all of Utah, that are not connected to waterways. And so you can't actually have access to these through water. So water is limited in terms of what it can actually bring in terms of connecting different parts of the country. And that goes to railroads. So similar pictures. Here's 1840. By 1870, you see how many more railroads there were. And in 1911, almost entirely access anywhere in the United States by railroads. So railroads really were this large advancement in terms of connecting the country. And the effect this had, this is, I think, a really important picture, is what this shows is the importance of a bunch of local economies becoming a national economy. So this graph shows the price difference of the percent of New York price compared to the Chicago price of wheat. And you see that with as the railroads, as we go back to those previous pictures, as the railroads expand, the price of wheat begins to converge to zero. I mean, there's no difference in price of wheat sold in Chicago to wheat sold in New York. And that's a really big factor that transportation had, is it really brought down the size of or brought the economy down to a single economy nationwide. And the railroad really had that impact. You also see this really big rise of the city. So in 1820, 7.2% of the population lived in a big city. By 1860, almost 1 in 5. And so here are the major cities at that time, the 6 largest cities. They're all built in these traditional geographical locations on waterways. And what happens is with the advent of the railroad is you're able then to grow food outside of the city, nowhere near the city, and transport it in. So as a result, you could grow wheat in the Midwest and still be able to transport that in before it goes bad. Fruits, vegetables, the whole deal. Furthermore is with large increases in industry, because you can actually have bigger factories now because you can reach a larger market, there's more jobs in cities. And so we see this urbanization happening in the 1800s where people start moving to very big cities because that's where the job is. That's where the job growths are. So why is New York City so big? This has always been interesting to me. I lived in upstate New York for 5 years. Why is it that New York City is so big? Well, there's 4 reasons that was in an article that discussed this. The first is they set up an auction system for imported goods. So any European country could bring their goods to New York and auction them off to the highest bidder. And since free markets at work. And this was not true in Boston and Baltimore and other cities, is if you brought goods there, you would have to find a buyer yourself. And that would sometimes take time or very costly. So this auction system really set up an incentive for European countries to ship their goods to New York City instead of other Atlantic cities. They also set up a mail service from New York City to Europe. They also developed a lot of coastal trade. They focused on industries like textile industry that brought the cotton from the south and able to convert that cotton to textiles and then ship it out from there. And the fourth is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, if we show right here, transects all of the upper tier of New York. And then that connects New York to all of these Great Lakes states, so Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. And so as a result, all the products that were being produced there could be shipped through the Erie Canal straight to New York City. And so New York City saw a very large boom in terms of its size at this time period. Another really interesting study by Kirsten Enflo talks about can cities just be placed anywhere? And so she looks at a random experiment where in Sweden in the late 1500s, the king established cities in new locations. Now, the difference between a Swedish town and a Swedish city is a Swedish city had the right, granted by the king, to trade with other cities. And so by identifying these cities, what was found is these cities did not grow very quickly at first. But with the Industrial Revolution, when transportation allowed them to be connected to other cities and to have transport quicker, that's when they began to thrive. And so really you see that innovation and the impact that innovation, specifically infrastructure innovation, can have on a city. Now let's talk real quick about the case of Utah, because Utah is a really interesting case because the Transcontinental Railroad is what brought Utah on the map. And so when we think about going from sea to shining sea, it costs about $1,000 to travel across the country. The California Gold Rush in 1849 created a very large demand for people to cross the country and to go to California and to start to develop the West Coast. But it can be very dangerous. The Donner Party is a case in point of this. And so the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 was passed. And what that act tried to do was to connect the Union Pacific, which was coming from Omaha, with the Central Pacific, which was coming from Sacramento. And they were to meet in Utah. And so as a result, it was Utah where the Golden Spike was nailed down and Promontory Point that connected the Transcontinental Railroad. And because of that, the railroad had some really interesting impacts on the Utah economy. Because at the same time that the railroad was coming, a lot of rich deposits of minerals were discovered in this area. So when we think of Cedar City, is located in Iron County. You have Coal Creek nearby, Minersville. This is a picture of 2,000 flushes located just west of Cedar City, an old iron mining mine. And so there's a lot of mining that happened. And so that really led to the advent, or the coming in of the railroad and the advent of mining, set up for some really interesting times in the Utah economy. And so this impact really had 5 different impacts. I think this is important to talk about. So the first is it led Utah to go from a closed economy to an open economy. An open economy is one that engages in commerce or trade with other countries or with other economies. And so Utah was closed. They didn't engage in a lot of trade outside of the Utah and the early Mormon settlements. But with the railroad, it opened up that economy. And so it literally made it so it was a self-contained closed economy to a very open economy, which brought new goods, new resources, and new competition to the area. At the same time, the mining industry was a big challenge because oftentimes in these mining communities, the mine they'd excavate and they'd mine all the minerals they could, and then they'd just leave, and it would leave cities decimated. Similar things happened in the oil boom in North Dakota. During the boom, North Dakota expanded greatly, but afterwards, literally ghost towns are left. And so Brigham Young, who was the governor of Utah at the time, tried to address this by building refineries in the Salt Lake Valley. So any of the mining that occurred in the mountains would be brought to Salt Lake Valley, and then he tried to diversify the different industries that were focused on in the Utah. The third is the influx immigration. One of the reasons why Brigham Young was behind support of the railroad was because it would bring immigrants to Utah. But it also brought a lot more than just Mormon immigrants to Utah, and it created a large influx of immigrants coming to the community, which really changed the type of economy that it was because the economy was growing in size. The other thing that was a major challenge was state versus federal governance. This is, again, the Hamilton-Jeffersonian debate. Though Utah was not a state, it was only a territory, they were seeking governance of their own at that time. Brigham Young was both the governor of the Utah Territory and the prophet of the LDS Church. And so that was a big challenge of what is that rule that they had and how would you balance that out? There was a lot of contention that time between Utah governance and the federal governments. And the fifth thing is this idea of private enterprise for economic development. The reason I say private is because it can be argued it was private, it can be argued it isn't private. So here's an old map. So here you have the Transcontinental Railroad comes here, but it's this, and that came across in Ogden. And so Brigham Young wanted to build a railroad from Ogden down to Salt Lake City. Well, in helping Union Pacific build this railroad right here, what happened was that Union Pacific promised to pay workers if Utah could supply the workers to build the railroad, to grade the land to build the rail. So they did. But Union Pacific didn't actually have cash to pay the workers. So they paid the workers in kind. They gave them a lot of railroad supplies. As a result, all these workers, and the trustee and trust was Brigham Young for this operation, had a lot of railroad supplies, but not any money. And so Brigham Young passed a bond to raise money to pay these workers, and then to use those supplies and then build a railroad from Ogden down to the capital territory of Salt Lake City. What's interesting is the reason I say private is Brigham Young, though he was the governor of Utah, or the Utah Territory, was also the president of the LDS Church. It was through the labor of the LDS Church that they built the railroad from Ogden down to Salt Lake City. And so if it's a church organization, we call that would be a private enterprise. As Brigham Young was both the president of both the church and of the territory, it leads to the question of was this really private? But what's really interesting is it was the LDS Church that built a lot of these railroads throughout Utah with their labor. And then when they were finished, they would actually sell them back to either private enterprisers or to the Union Pacific. And so these rails were then eventually sold back to the Union Pacific system. And so it was this very interesting time of developing the infrastructure from within Utah in terms of a private enterprise. And so really the railroad is this fascinating case study in terms of the development of Utah because it fundamentally changed Utah as a state, and it changed Utah's economy because of those 5 reasons that we talked about. And so as we look at going forward, what we'll see is that the development of infrastructure is going to lead to a lot more innovations because it's able to connect producers to a lot more consumers. And that's what we'll talk about in the next chapter.